She is standing on the letter H. It is a Friday night in September 1932, and the letter is 50 feet tall, made of sheet metal and telephone poles and 4,000 light bulbs that blink on and off against the sky above Los Angeles. The bulbs throw white light down onto the scrub in the dirt road below and up onto her, so that from a distance, if anyone were looking, she would appear as a small white figure at the very top of the crossbar, wind in her coat, a city spreading out to the horizon in front of her. Her name is Millicent Lillian Entwistle, though no one calls her that. Her friends call her Peg. She is 24 years old. She has climbed this letter using a workman's ladder that someone left leaning against the back of it. In her purse, at the foot of the ladder, she has placed a folded coat, a pair of shoes she stepped out of, and a handwritten note signed with only her initials. The sign behind her does not yet say Hollywood. It says Hollywoodland. It is an advertisement for a real estate development in the hills, and in a few minutes, it will become something else entirely. She looks out at the city once, and then she steps forward. To understand how she got there, we have to go back almost a quarter of a century, and we have to cross an ocean, because she did not start in California. She started in Wales. Port Talbot is a steel town on the south coast of Wales, and in February of 1908, in a small stone house in the Margam district, an English actor named Robert Entwistle and his wife Emily had a daughter. They named her Millicent Lillian, but almost from the beginning in the family, she was Peg. Her father was a touring stage actor, the kind who worked in repertory companies and crossed the country with a trunk and a costume case and a pair of good shoes. Her mother was the daughter of a family with theatrical connections of their own. It was not a settled life, and it did not stay settled for long. When Peg was 2 years old, her parents divorced. The official story, the one she would be told as a child, was that her mother had died. The truth, and this will not come out for years, was that her mother was alive in England, and that her father did not want his daughter to have anything to do with her. It is the first lie in Peg Entwistle's life, and it comes from the person closest to her. In 1913, a Broadway producer named Charles Frohman sent for Robert Entwistle to come to New York as a stage manager. The whole family came, Robert and little Peg, and Robert's brother Charles, and Charles's American wife Jane, who was from a nice family in Cincinnati. They sailed from England on a steamship and came into New York Harbor on a bright morning in the summer, and the 5-year-old girl who stepped onto the dock in Lower Manhattan had no idea she would never live in England again. Robert remarried. His new wife, Loretta Ross, was Aunt Jane's sister. These things ran close in theatrical families, and they had 2 sons, Peg's half-brothers, Milton and Robert. For a while, they lived on West 88th Street in an apartment in the 80s, and the family photographs from this period show a serious-looking girl with dark hair and wide eyes standing very straight between her 2 small brothers, holding their hands as if she were already old enough to be responsible for them. Then, in 1921, her stepmother, Loretta, died of meningitis. She was 35. And the following autumn, in November of 1922, Peg's father, Robert, was walking on Park Avenue near 72nd Street when a car hit him. It was a hit and run. He lingered in the hospital for 48 days, and he died just before Christmas. Peg was 14 years old. Her half-brothers were 4 and 2. The Entwistle children were taken in by Uncle Charles and Aunt Jane, the same aunt and uncle who had crossed the Atlantic with them 9 years before. Uncle Charles had been managing Broadway actors. He gave it up. Aunt Jane had been acting herself. She gave it up too. They built a household around 3 orphan children, and they raised them as their own. It was Aunt Jane, years later, who would finally tell Peg the truth about her mother. Peg had grown up believing that Emily had died when she was a little girl. She had grown up believing that the story of her mother ended in a grave in England. It wasn't until she was a teenager, asking questions her uncle could no longer easily deflect, that the actual story came out. That Emily had been alive all along. That her parents had divorced because Emily had been unfaithful, and that her father had simply told the child a different story rather than explain it. Emily was alive until 1927. Peg was 19 when her mother actually died. Whether they were ever in contact in those last years, whether Peg wrote to her, whether they met, the family records do not say. There are letters in private archives that may answer it eventually. But the simple fact is that the first grief of Peg's life, the thing she had been mourning since she was 2 years old, was a fiction. The mother who was supposed to be dead was not dead. And then, just when Peg was old enough to do something about it, she was. Here is where the shape of Peg's life starts to appear, and here is where you have to pay attention. Because two things are happening at once. On the one hand, she is a teenager in mourning. She has lost a mother she was told she never had, a stepmother and a father, all in the space of a few years. On the other hand, she has decided what she is going to do with her life. She has decided she is going to be an actress. A cousin later said that Peg saw a play when she was 13 called Peg O' My Heart, about a wild Irish girl, and she fell in love with the character and fell in love with the name, and from that moment on, she was Peg. Not Millicent. Not Lillian. Peg. In 1924, when she was 16, she moved to Boston to study with Henry Jewett's repertory company, which was one of the most respected companies in the country at the time. And the following January, at the age of 17, she was cast as Hedvig in Henrik Ibsen's The Wild Duck. Hedvig is a 14-year-old girl who ends the play by taking her own life in an attic. It is one of the most devastating scenes in modern theater, and by all accounts, Peg Entwistle played it extraordinarily. One night, in the audience, was a 17-year-old girl from Lowell, Massachusetts, who had come to see the play with her mother. After the curtain came down, this girl turned to her mother on the sidewalk outside the theater, and she said, and this quote is in the girl's own autobiography, word for word, "I want to be exactly like Peg Entwistle." The girl's name was Ruth Elizabeth Davis. You know her as Bet. Remember that. Come back to it in an hour. Peg's Uncle Charles was a friend of the great Broadway actor Walter Hampton, and Hampton gave Peg a tiny walk-on role in his production of Hamlet starring Ethel Barrymore. She carried the king's train. She brought in the poison cup. She didn't have a line. But she was on a Broadway stage at 17, and by the following summer, she had been invited to join the New York Theater Guild, which was the most prestigious theatrical organization in America. In June of 1926, she had her first credited Broadway role in a comedy called The Man from Toronto. The play ran only 28 performances, but she got noticed. And for the next 6 years, she worked, steadily, continuously, in 10 Broadway productions, with every major name of the American stage. George M. Cohan directed her personally. She shared stages with Dorothy Gish and Lorette Taylor and William Gillette, the great Sherlock Holmes of his era. She toured the country for the Theater Guild's 10th anniversary, a tour orchestrated by George Bernard Shaw from across the Atlantic. In 1927, she was cast in a comedy called Tommy, starring Sidney Toler. It ran for 232 performances at the Gaiety Theater, and it was the longest-running play of her life. A reviewer for the New York Times, J. Brooks Atkinson, a serious critic, not an easy one, wrote of another play that had closed quickly. Peg Entwistle gave a performance considerably better than the play warranted. The Theater Guild in those years was something like the Ivy League of the American stage. They did Eugene O'Neill. They did George Bernard Shaw. They did Ibsen and Chekhov and Strindberg and whatever else the more commercial houses were afraid to touch. To be a member of the Guild at 19 was to be marked by everyone who paid attention to these things as a serious young actress headed somewhere serious. She changed characters every week. She played ingenues and comic daughters, and the good-hearted girl next door. She was tall, with dark hair and a strong profile, and she had, by every surviving account, a voice. A trained, carrying stage voice that filled a house without any obvious effort. In 1929, she gave an interview to a theatrical reporter in which she said something that is worth quoting, because it is one of the few places in the historical record where you hear her talk about her own craft. She said, and this is her, word for word, "I would rather play roles that carry conviction. Maybe it is because they are the easiest and yet the hardest things for me to do. To play any kind of an emotional scene, I must work up to a certain pitch. If I reach this in my first word, the rest of the words and lines take care of themselves. But if I fail, I have to build up the balance of the speeches, and in doing this the whole characterization falls flat. I feel that I am cheating myself." That is not the voice of a failure. That is the voice of a working actress, 21 years old, who has already thought carefully about how she does what she does, and who is telling a reporter, politely, that she takes it seriously. This is the woman history forgot. This is the woman who stands behind the legend, not a failure, not a starlet who flamed out. A working professional actress, good enough to inspire Bette Davis, good enough to earn rave notices even in productions that bombed, good enough at 19 years old to hold her own on a Broadway stage with the biggest names in the country. In April of 1927, she got married. His name was Robert Keith. He was a fellow actor, 10 years older than she was, handsome, charming, a working stage player with good prospects. They met in a production and married quickly. By some accounts, they had known each other only a matter of weeks, at the chapel of the New York City clerk's office on April the 18th. She was 19. He was 29. It lasted 2 years, and it is one of the 2 stories about Peg Entwistle that nobody tells. Here is what she would later testify to in court. She did not know when she married him that he had been married before. She did not know he had a son. His first marriage had produced a little boy, 6 years old at the time Peg filed for divorce, a child she had never been told existed. The little boy's name was Brian Keith. He would grow up to become a television star, the uncle in Family Affair, the father in The Parent Trap. But in 1929, he was a small child Robert Keith had simply failed to mention to his new wife. There was more. According to her biographer James Zaruk, who interviewed Peg's brother Milton and had access to the family's own archive, Robert Keith drank. He drank badly. They were sent on tour together as a married couple in a Theater Guild production, and in West Virginia he was arrested for driving drunk. In Michigan, in a hotel room, he attacked her while she was lying in bed, pulling handfuls of hair from her scalp while she screamed until the hotel detective broke down the door and pulled him off her. She went back to him after that. He promised to stop drinking. He did not stop drinking. In May of 1929, she filed for divorce in New York. She cited cruelty. She cited infidelity. She cited the concealment of his prior marriage and his child. The divorce was granted. She was 21 years old. The court records of that era were public. The papers picked up on the divorce and the details. A 21-year-old actress charging her actor husband with deceit and cruelty, and naming specifics about a prior marriage and a son, made for a few paragraphs of tabloid copy that circulated in New York for about a week and then sank out of memory, except in the memories of the particular Broadway producers whose wives read those papers and raised an eyebrow at the breakfast table. There is no evidence that any single producer blacklisted her. There is evidence that a certain chill entered her castings after 1929, that certain doors that had been open in 1927 were not as open anymore, that the same Peg Entwistle who had been a golden ingenue at the Theater Guild was now, at 21, a divorcee, which was a category that complicated her casting in a way that required a producer to decide, each time, whether she was worth the complication. The Robert Keith marriage would have 2 long shadows over the rest of her life. One was that it damaged her reputation among some of the more conservative Broadway producers, who did not like divorces and did not like scandal, and remembered her name when it came time to cast. The other was more private. She was 21, a divorcee, working in a business that was not kind to women who had been publicly disappointed, and she had been raised by an uncle and an aunt who had given up their careers to raise her. And somewhere inside all of that, she began to carry a weight that her letters home do not quite name, but do not quite hide either. She wrote often, and she wrote cheerfully, but a sister of hers would later recall that Peg had a way of going quiet. She'd be laughing, And then she'd be staring at nothing. And then she'd be back, and you'd wonder if you'd imagined it. She kept working. In 1932, she was understudying Laurette Taylor in a Broadway revival of J.M. Barrie's Alice Sit by the Fire. Laurette Taylor was one of the greatest American stage actresses of the 20th century, but she had a drinking problem of her own, and the production fell apart after a week. The producers paid Peg a fraction of what she had been promised. And at just about the same moment, two producers in Los Angeles, Edward Belasco and Homer Curran, sent word that they wanted her for a new Romney-Brent comedy called The Mad Hopes, opposite Billie Burke and a young actor named Humphrey Bogart. The play would try out at the Belasco Theater on Broadway, and then move on. Peg packed a suitcase, got on a train, and went west. It was the spring of 1932, and she was moving in with her Uncle Charles and Aunt Jane again, at a house at 2428 Beechwood Drive, in a canyon in the Hollywood Hills. From their front porch, if you looked up past the eucalyptus trees and the scrub, you could see a brand new sign on the side of a mountain, 50 feet tall, lit up at night, spelling out the name of the real estate development the house was part of. It was called Hollywoodland. The Mad Hopes opened on May the 19th. It was a smash. The Los Angeles Examiner wrote, in a review that would survive her by the better part of a century, "In the cast, Peg Entwistle and Humphrey Bogart hold first place in supporting the star, and both give fine, serious performances. Miss Entwistle as the earnest young daughter presents a charming picture of youth." Audiences were standing. The play sold out. Plans were being made to move it to New York in the fall, with the original cast. For 3 weeks, in the middle of 1932, during the worst year of the Great Depression, Peg Entwistle was exactly where she wanted to be. On stage, getting raves, headed back to Broadway with a hit. Humphrey Bogart was 32 years old that spring. He was not yet a star. He had been doing minor roles in New York for about a decade, and occasional pictures in Hollywood that had gone nowhere. And he was 3 years away from The Petrified Forest, and almost a full decade from Casablanca. Some accounts from that summer suggest that he and Peg had an affair during the run. No letters survived to prove it one way or the other, and both of them were known to be private people about that sort of thing. Whatever passed between them backstage at the Belasco, it was brief, and Bogart went east with the rest of the company when the play moved to Broadway. And Peg did not. Because 3 days after the play closed, while she was packing her trunk to go back to New York, the phone rang. It was RKO Radio Pictures. David O. Selznick himself, 29 years old, already head of production, the man who would one day produce Gone with the Wind, had seen her in The Mad Hopes. He wanted to give her a screen test. She took it. She signed a contract. She let the Mad Hopes cast board the train for New York without her. She was going to be in the movies. This is where a different story could have ended, and it's worth pausing on it, because the life she thought she was walking into in June of 1932 was as bright as any young actress's in America. She was 24. She had just come off a smash production. She was on a term contract at a major studio. She had beaten Robert Keith. She had a home with family in California. When she wrote to her brother Milton, who remembered the letters his whole long life, she sounded happy. She sounded like someone at the beginning of something. She even believed at one point that she had been cast in a George Cukor film called A Bill of Divorcement, in a role she was excited about. That role would eventually go to a young stage actress Cukor was bringing out from New York, a young woman named Katharine Hepburn. But Peg didn't know that yet. What Peg got instead was a project called 13 Women. 13 Women was based on a sensational 1930 bestseller by a writer named Tiffany Thayer. It was about a group of old sorority sisters who are being systematically destroyed by a mysterious Eurasian woman with hypnotic powers, played by Myrna Loy. The cast was serious: Myrna Loy, Irene Dunne, Ricardo Cortez. The budget was big. The character Peg was assigned to play was Hazel Cousins, one of the sorority sisters. In the novel, Hazel is a beautiful virgin who is eventually seduced by another woman, a character named Martha, described by Thayer in terms that were crude even for 1930. and who then starves herself to death in a sanitarium. Heartbroken. In the screenplay Peg actually shot, Hazel's sexuality was muted but not hidden. She had scenes with the female character. She had a dissolve that strongly implied the two women had gone to bed together. She had a line to her husband, who she eventually stabs to death, in which she tells him, and this is the line, "I don't like to be pawed. I never liked it. I just let you because I thought I had to." Peg shot her scenes that summer. She had the first 22 minutes of the movie. In the rough cut, she had a supporting role roughly 16 minutes long. It was, by the standards of a 1932 feature debut, a substantial part. The film was previewed for audiences, and the audiences revolted, not at Peg's performance, at the implication. A lesbian storyline, even a muted one, was not what preview audiences in 1932 were prepared for, and the Studio Relations Committee, which was the pre-Hays Code censorship body inside the industry, was already breathing down the studio's neck. RKO panicked. The editors went back into the film. They cut nearly every scene Peg had with the female character. They re-edited the scene in which she attends a circus where one of her sorority sisters falls to her death from a trapeze, a scene, incidentally, that you may want to think about later, to remove the other woman almost entirely. They reduced her role from 16 minutes to approximately 4. In the final cut of 13 Women, Peg Entwistle's character stabs her husband for no reason the audience can discern, and we learn about it only through a newspaper headline that reads, "Mrs. Hazel Cousins admits slaying, says, 'I must have lost my mind.'" That's it. That's the part. That's the entire arc of the character the audiences in 1932 took home. She had not failed. The studio had failed her. The role she was hired for, the role she gave her best performance in, the role that might have launched her, was dismembered in an editing room because the country was not ready to see what she had been asked to play. She didn't know. Nobody told her. She did not see the final cut of the movie before she died. If you watch 13 Women now, which is not hard to do, the film is in the public domain and copies exist in several archives, you can see her. She is on screen for 4 minutes. She is tall. She is serious. She has a long scene in a dressing room in the middle of the picture where she speaks a few lines about her husband and stares at her reflection in a vanity mirror, and in that moment, for about 40 seconds, you can see why she was cast. There is a kind of quiet behind the eyes. There is a presence. She holds the camera, and then the scene cuts, and the film moves on. And the character she was paid to play disappears for the rest of the movie. And a newspaper headline tells you she killed her husband, and the story of her own film is over. An intelligent person watching it today will feel, unmistakably, that someone is missing. That is because someone is. What she did here, in late August, was that RKO was not picking up her contract. Understand what that meant. It meant she had broken with a successful Broadway play, The Mad Hopes, which had gone to New York without her, to sign with a movie studio that was now letting her go. It meant she had burned the bridge and arrived on the other side and found that the ground was gone too. Her roommate in New York wrote to say that their apartment had been lost for unpaid rent and their furniture had been seized. The Broadway producers she had left behind were not enthusiastic about her return. It was the worst year of the Depression. She was living on her uncle's charity again, at 24, in the same bedroom she'd slept in when she first arrived from New York. A bedroom that looked up the canyon at a 50-foot letter H that glowed at night with 4,000 light bulbs. She kept trying. She auditioned for stage roles in Los Angeles. She went to parties. Friends from that period later recalled that she was drinking more than she had, that the cheerful, steady Peg they had known in New York was thinner and quieter, that she had a way of disappearing into herself at the end of an evening. A co-star from The Mad Hopes later said she had seemed tired, in a way actresses her age weren't supposed to be tired. She wrote to Milton. She went on walks up the canyon roads with her Aunt Jane. She was 24, and she was beginning to suspect, or to fear, that the thing she had trained for since she was 16 was slipping out of her hands, and that she did not know how to get it back. There are small details from that summer that do not, on their own, mean anything, and together are the whole picture. She cut her hair. She had always worn it longer. That summer she had it bobbed. Her aunt later remembered her sitting on the porch at Beechwood in the heat, writing letters, tearing them up, starting them again. She wrote to friends in New York asking about possible stage work and heard back sometimes, but not often enough. The Depression had closed Broadway houses by the dozen in the preceding year. There were, simply, fewer plays. And the productions that were being mounted were smaller, and the pay was worse, and the competition was sharper. And the producers, who had already been cool to her after the Robert Keith divorce, had not warmed in her absence. A letter from her roommate, who had been living in their apartment in New York, arrived to say that the landlord had evicted them, that their furniture had been seized for unpaid back rent, and that whatever Peg owned in the city was gone. Everything she had was in her bedroom at 2428 Beechwood. She was not, and this needs to be said plainly because the legend says otherwise, destitute. Her uncle and aunt loved her and fed her and kept a roof over her head. She was not sleeping on a bench in a park. She was not starving in a furnished room. She was living with the same family that had raised her after her father died, in a house in the hills. And she was 24 years old and out of work in a city whose only business was work she could not get. And she could see, from the porch, the sign that was the symbol of the industry that had just finished with her. Every night, when it got dark, it came on. 4,000 light bulbs, blinking in sequence, Hollywoodland, over and over, across the valley. It lit up her bedroom window. She could not have turned it off if she had wanted to. The summer of 1932 in Los Angeles was brutally hot. It was, by all contemporary accounts, one of the hottest the city had seen in years. The canyon baked. The mountain behind the house shimmered. The sign on the mountain stayed lit at night, blinking one letter at a time. Holly, and then wood, and then land, and then Hollywoodland all at once, over and over. A metronome of an advertisement for a real estate development. On Friday, September the 16th, in the early evening, Peg told her aunt and uncle that she was going out for a walk. She said she was going down to a drugstore, and then to see some friends. People who were there that night remembered that she seemed cheerful, or at least not obviously unhappy, and that she took her purse and put on a jacket and walked out the front door at 2428 Beechwood Drive. She walked up the road instead of down it. She walked past the last houses of Hollywoodland, past the paved road and onto the dirt track that ran along the side of Mount Lee, up through brush and sage in the heat of the late afternoon. She climbed the hill. She reached the back of the Hollywoodland sign, where a workman's ladder had been left leaning against the letter H. She took off her jacket. She took off one of her shoes. She placed them at the base of the letter along with her purse. She took out a piece of paper and a pen, and she wrote, in her own hand, 15 words. "I am afraid I am a coward. I am sorry for everything. If I had done this a long time ago, it would have saved a lot of pain. P.E." She folded the note. She put it in the purse. She climbed the ladder. On Sunday the 18th, a woman hiking the trail below the sign came across the shoe first, then the purse, then the jacket. She opened the purse and read the note. She looked down over the edge of the trail and she saw, in the ravine 100 feet below, the body of a young woman. She carried the jacket, the shoe, and the purse down the mountain, and she laid them on the front steps of the Hollywood police station, and she went home. She did not leave her name. She did not wait to be interviewed. For decades, no one knew who she was. The only record of her is a line in an early police report that describes a woman, no further identification, who arrived with the items and departed before officers could properly question her. A detective and 2 officers returned to the ravine. They brought the body to the Los Angeles County morgue, where it was tagged as Jane Doe. The coroner's report gave the cause of death as multiple fractures of the pelvis. That meant something. It meant she had not died from the fall itself. It meant she had survived the impact, possibly for some minutes, possibly longer, lying alone at the bottom of a ravine under the blinking lights of the sign above her, and had bled to death from the fractures. We do not know exactly how long. We do not like to know. The police did not know who she was. The note was signed only with initials. Tuesday's morning papers printed the note and printed a description. The Los Angeles Herald-Examiner, not the Times, came up with the nickname by which she would be remembered for the rest of the century. They called her the Hollywood Sign Girl. That morning, on Beechwood Drive, her uncle Harold Entwistle, who was also an actor, Peg's father's brother, living nearby, opened the paper and read the description and read the note, and connected it to the niece he had not seen in 2 days, a niece who had said she was going to the drugstore. He drove to the morgue. He identified her. He telephoned her Uncle Charles and Aunt Jane. Milton, Peg's little brother, was 14 years old. He was in school when they told him. He would remember that moment for the next 7 decades. There is one more thing. It is a story people have told about her for so long that it has taken on the shape of a legend. And for that reason, it is worth saying plainly what is true and what is not. The story is that a day or two after her death, a letter arrived at the Beechwood Drive house addressed to Peg, offering her a leading role in a play at the Beverly Hills Playhouse, and that the role was the role of a young woman who takes her own life. That story was published by Kenneth Anger in a book called Hollywood Babylon 2, a book that was not especially careful with its facts, and no one has ever been able to produce the letter, or the Playhouse's correspondence, or any specific play. Careful researchers believe the story is probably not true. It is too neat. It is the sort of thing that attaches itself to a tragedy in the weeks afterward. And yet people have repeated it for 90 years because they want the story to be that tidy. Because they want her death to mean something shaped like a door closing just after she stepped through it. And because the real story of Peg Entwistle, is much harder to shape into a single lesson. Her funeral was held on September the 20th at the W.M. Struthers Mortuary at 6240 Hollywood Boulevard, an Episcopal service conducted in a small chapel in the middle of a neighborhood named for the industry that had just finished cutting her out of its film. She was cremated that same week at Hollywood Cemetery. Her ashes sat in storage for 3 months because the family did not have the money to ship them east. On December the 29th, the urn was sent on a train to Ohio. On January the 5th of 1933, in the Ross family plot, Aunt Jane's family, the Cincinnati branch of the extended Entwistle-Ross world that had taken her in after her father died, her ashes were interred in the grave of her father Robert in a small cemetery in a village north of Cincinnati called Glendale. 13 Women premiered at the Roxy Theater in New York City on October the 15th of 1932, almost a month to the day after she died. The studio quietly declined to put her name at the top of the advertising. It opened in Los Angeles in November to tepid reviews and mediocre business. By 1935, when it was re-released, another 14 minutes had been trimmed out of it. The original 73-minute version of the film is lost. The version we have today runs 59 minutes. What we see when we watch Peg Entwistle in the only film she ever made is not what she made. It is what is left of what she made after several rounds of cutting by strangers, some of whom never met her, and some of whom were alive when she went up the mountain. Now, let me tell you what happened to some of the other people. Robert Keith, her first husband, the man who lied to her about his prior marriage and his son and pulled the hair out of her head in a Michigan hotel room in 1929, kept working. He cleaned up, more or less. He married a fourth wife in 1930, a woman named Dorothy Tierney, and stayed married to her until he died. He became a well-regarded character actor in Hollywood. He played the police chief in The Wild One, Marlon Brando's movie. He played a part in Guys and Dolls. He played the psychopathic gangster in The Lineup in 1958. He died in 1966. Among the honorary pallbearers at his funeral were Ronald Reagan, Edward G. Robinson, and James Cagney. His son Brian, the little boy Peg had not known existed when she married his father, grew up to become one of the most beloved American television stars of the 1960s. For 5 seasons, Brian Keith played Uncle Bill on Family Affair, a widowed engineer raising his brother's 3 children in a New York high-rise. He was the warm, gruff substitute parent of millions of American childhoods. He also played the father in The Parent Trap with Haley Mills in 1961. And in 1997, suffering from lung cancer and grieving the loss of his daughter Daisy 2 months earlier, Daisy, an actress herself, had also taken her own life. Brian Keith took his own life as well. The stepson Peg Entwistle had never gotten to know, and the step-granddaughter she never met, ended their lives the same way she had ended hers, 65 years apart. The Keith family gene for this particular kind of grief ran deeper than anybody ever quite wanted to say out loud. David O. Selznick, who signed her, went on to produce A Star is Born in 1937, Gone with the Wind in 1939, and Rebecca in 1940. The role Peg thought she was being signed to play, the daughter in A Bill of Divorcement, went to Katharine Hepburn in Hepburn's screen debut, and it launched Hepburn's career. Myrna Loy, Peg's co-star in 13 Women, became the thin man's wife and one of the most beloved leading ladies of the decade. Humphrey Bogart, who had received first billing alongside Peg in the rave review of The Mad Hopes, spent the rest of the 1930s toiling in B pictures before his breakthrough in The Petrified Forest, and then Casablanca. Billie Burke, who had starred with her at the Belasco, went on to play Glinda the Good Witch in The Wizard of Oz. Every single one of them who had stood on a stage with Peg Entwistle in the summer of 1932 went on to have exactly the kind of career she had crossed a continent for. And the letter H. In 1949, after years of weather and neglect, the Hollywoodland sign was falling apart. The real estate development was long since complete. The sign had outlived its purpose. The Chamber of Commerce took the last 4 letters off, the L, the A, the N, the D, and kept the rest and shortened it from Hollywoodland to Hollywood. And the H, Peg's H, the letter she had stood on, was so badly rotted by then that it had to be rebuilt. It is not the same letter, but it is in the same place. If you drive up Beechwood Drive today, if you stand on the sidewalk outside the house at 2428 where her uncle and aunt lived, and where she packed her trunk for New York and never got on the train, and you look up the canyon, you can still see it. You can see it from half the windows in Los Angeles. It is arguably the most famous 9 letters on Earth. And no one who looks at it thinks of Hollywoodland. And very few of the millions of tourists who photograph it each year know that a young stage actress climbed the first one of those letters on a Friday night in 1932 and jumped off because a studio had rewritten her into something she could not recognize. Here, now, is the thing I asked you to remember an hour ago. In 1938, a Broadway director named Blanche Yerka, who had directed Peg in The Wild Duck in Boston back in 1925, and who had known her well, was casting a revival. She sent a note to a young actress in Hollywood who was already becoming famous, and asked her if she would be interested in playing Hedvig, the 14-year-old girl who takes her own life in the attic. The young actress sent word back. She had known, she said, from the moment she saw Peg Entwistle play Hedvig in Boston when she was 17, that one day she would play the part. The young actress's name was Bette Davis. She played it. She cited Peg Entwistle as her inspiration for becoming an actress many times in her own life, in interviews in the 40s and 50s, and in her 1962 autobiography. Bette Davis won 2 Academy Awards. She was nominated for 10. She starred in Jezebel, in All About Eve, in Now, Voyager, in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. She lived to be 81 years old. And every time she was asked why she had become an actress in the first place, she gave the same answer. A girl on a stage in Boston, a play by Ibsen, a performance she could not forget. Peg Antwistle never knew. That is the other ending of this story. The one that runs parallel to the ravine under the sign. The career she thought she had failed to have, she in fact had, not in herself, but in someone else. In someone sitting in an audience with her mother on a winter night in 1925. In someone who went home to Lowell, Massachusetts, and told her mother on the sidewalk outside the theater, "I want to be exactly like Peg Entwistle." The thing Peg Entwistle wanted most in the world, which was to be remembered, was already guaranteed the night she took her first serious stage role at 17. She had simply done it so quietly and so early that she did not know. She could not know. It happened in the dark, in the audience, to a stranger, and the stranger grew up to be Bette Davis and became the version of Peg Entwistle that history would eventually see on the screen. One more thing, and then the story is almost over. In the decades after her death, as Los Angeles grew up around Mount Lee and the sign became the symbol it is now, stories began to be told about her ghost. Hikers on the trails under the sign reported the smell of gardenias, which the newspapers had incorrectly reported her perfume to have been the night she died. Griffith Park rangers talked of seeing a figure in a white dress on moonlit nights. Other rangers thought it was nonsense. Either way, the trails under the sign are largely closed now, partly for public safety, partly because the city does not want to encourage anyone to follow her up that hill. The Hollywood Sign Trust put up additional fences in the 1990s. Cameras watch the approaches. Helicopters monitor it on quiet nights. Nobody has ever taken the same route she took again. She is the only documented person in history to have ended her life from the Hollywood sign. Not the first, as Kenneth Anger claimed. The only. Her character in 13 Women, Hazel Cousins, attends a circus performance in the first act of the movie and watches a sorority sister fall to her death from a trapeze. That scene is still in the final cut. You can see it on the disc. Peg Entwistle is in the audience at the circus, looking up, watching a young woman fall from a great height to her death on the floor below. She filmed the scene in July of 1932. She had 2 months to live. Her brother Milton Entwistle lived to be very old. He gave interviews to the biographer James Zaruk decades after she died. He remembered her. He said she was funny. He said she was kind to him. He said she used to sing in the kitchen. He said she wrote letters home from New York, from tour, from Los Angeles. He said she was happier than the history books give her credit for being, for most of her life. He said that what had been done to her was not what she had done to herself, and that the world had the proportions of her story backward, and that the person who had actually lived it did not see herself the way the newsreels had made her. He said he still had her letters. He said that when the Hollywoodland sign was taken down in 1949 and became Hollywood, he had thought, for a moment, that she had taken 4 letters with her. He was quiet for a while after he said that, and then he said, "She was my big sister." The last thing Peg Entwistle wrote, in the coat pocket at the base of a ladder behind a letter H on a mountain, was signed with her initials, PE 2 letters, an H, a 14-foot apostrophe short of the whole word. She went up the mountain believing she was a failure, and she left the 2 letters of her name at the foot of 1 letter of the name of the industry that had made her believe it, and she climbed a ladder that had been left behind by workmen, and she stepped off the top. A young woman in a city that did not yet know her name. A stage actress Bette Davis would remember for the next 64 years. A daughter Robert Entwistle had lied to about her own mother. A wife Robert Keith had lied to about his own son. A working professional, cut from her own movie, because the country was not ready to see what she could do. A girl, finally, 24 years and 7 months and 12 days old, standing on a letter in the dark. The cemetery is called Oak Hill. It is in the village of Glendale, just north of Cincinnati, in the rolling country between Ohio and Kentucky, which is quieter than you would expect and greener than you would expect. And in the spring, the dogwoods along the drive turn the whole place the color of a stage curtain. Oak Hill was chartered in 1910. It is now part of the Spring Grove family of cemeteries, and it serves the old families of Glendale and the surrounding towns. The Entwistle plot is in Section 12, Lot 27, Grave 10. The Ross family plot, owned by her Aunt Jane's people, who had taken her in when her father died. Her father Robert is buried there. Her ashes were interred on top of him on the 5th of January, 1933. For 78 years, the grave had no marker. It was a patch of grass under a tree in a corner of an Ohio cemetery, and unless you knew the section and the lot and the grave number, you would walk past it without knowing anything of the story that had ended there. In September of 2010, a Hollywood historian named Lisa Cinco and a small group of Peg's online admirers raised the money for a stone. They installed it on September the 16th, 2010, the 78th anniversary of the night on Mount Lee. The marker is a low granite slab, flush with the ground, engraved with the names and dates of both Robert Symes Entwistle and Millicent Lillian Peg Entwistle, father and daughter, together at last on the same block of stone. The cemetery is open to visitors during daylight hours. People do come. They leave small things, a photograph sometimes, a dried flower. Once, someone left a ticket stub. The grave is not easy to find without directions, and Oak Hill does not advertise it, which is the way the family has always wanted it. If you stand there in the late afternoon with your back to the road and the tree above you starting to rattle with the light evening wind from the Ohio River Valley, what you notice is how quiet it is. No city sounds. No sign on any hillside. Only the birds and the wind, and a small piece of granite lying level with the grass.